Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. It's all about building a seriously impressive English vocabulary. You know, the kind that doesn't just make you sound smart, but actually helps you get what someone's saying and express yourself in a way that really hits the mark. We're going to be looking at your source material today and seeing what it has to say about all that.
Yeah, it's important, right?
Totally. So to kick things off, our source material suggests that we start with a classic technique, but with a bit of a twist. They call it flashcards and spaced repetition. Can you tell me a little more about that?
So flashcards themselves can definitely be helpful, but they can kind of lead to cramming and then forgetting everything you worked so hard for. Spaced repetition changes the game, though.
Oh, how so?
Well, imagine you learn a new word today.
Right.
Instead of reviewing it tomorrow, you actually space out those reviews and gradually increase how long you wait between them. So you might revisit that word in 2 days, then 5, then 10, and so on and so on.
So you're basically reminding your brain just as it's about to forget the word. That's so cool.
Exactly. You give your memory a little nudge at just the right time. Makes your brain work harder each time you see the word, too.
Makes sense. It's like a workout routine for your vocabulary, huh?
Yeah. Like a
The source material also talks about context clues, which always makes me think of being a detective.
is like that.
Yeah.
Instead of running to the dictionary, anytime you see a new word, you put on your detective hat
I love that.
and you start looking for clues
Huh?
right there in the sentence or the paragraph.
Oh, so like, what are the other words around it?
Exactly. What's the overall topic of what you're reading? You can
Right.
often figure out the meaning without ever cracking open a dictionary.
Our source actually has a great example.
hmm
It uses the phrase, "It's raining cats and dogs."
Ah, yeah, classic idiom.
Now, even if you've never heard that phrase before, I bet you could guess what it means.
Probably,
Yeah.
just from the context, right?
Yeah. If you're reading about a crazy storm and you see that phrase, it's probably a safe bet that it means it's raining really hard, even though cats and dogs aren't actually falling from the sky. Okay, so let's move on to a really cool idea that I found in the source material. Word families. What's the big deal with word families?
So think of word families kind of like these hidden networks of vocabulary
Oh, I like that.
that are just waiting for you to unlock them. They're groups of words that share a common root, and if you understand this system, it can really speed up how fast you learn new words.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example. How do word families work? In like the real world, you know?
Okay, so let's take the root struct. It means to build.
Okay.
And from this one root, we get a whole bunch of words like construct, structure, instruction, and even destruction.
Whoa.
And just by recognizing that shared root,
Yeah.
you can instantly figure out the core meaning of all of those words.
So understanding one root can help me understand a whole bunch of other words.
Right.
That's pretty efficient.
It is.
Okay, so what else does the source material say about word families?
The key is to be an active learner, right? When you see a new word, try to figure out its root, its prefixes and suffixes.
Right.
Look for patterns and connections. Try using different forms of words that you already know when you're speaking or writing.
Okay, that's a good tip. Let's switch gears for a second and talk about something that I think trips up a lot of English learners.
Oh, yeah.
Idioms and phrasal verbs. Why are they so important? What's the deal with those?
Those are the tricky ones, right? Idioms are those expressions that don't make sense if you take them literally.
Right, like kick the bucket.
Exactly. That one means to die. And then phrasal verbs, they combine a verb with a preposition or an adverb, and suddenly the meaning's totally different.
Oh yeah, like look up to means to admire someone.
Exactly.
That one always confused me.
Yeah, they can be confusing. They're important, though, for sounding natural and understanding everyday conversations.
Well, the source material mentions break a leg, which is such a weird way to wish someone good luck.
It is, yeah.
It seems like every time I turn around, there's another idiom or another phrasal verb to learn.
They're everywhere.
Yeah.
The best way to learn them, though, is to learn them in context, like we talked about with those context clues.
Oh, so pay attention to how they're used in real life conversations or in the books that I read.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment a little.
Ah.
Try using them in your own conversations.
Even if it's a little awkward.
Even if it feels weird at first,
Hmm.
the more you use them, the easier they will become.
Okay. So we've talked about flashcards with spaced repetition. We've talked about being a word detective with those context clues. And we've talked about the power of word families. But before we move on to part 2, what does the source material have to say about reading? It's got to be important.
Right. Reading is essential for building your vocabulary. It's like jumping into a pool full of words. It's where you encounter new words in their natural habitat.
So it's like going on a safari for words.
Yeah, exactly.
Welcome back to our deep dive, all about how to build a powerful English vocabulary. I feel like we've already learned a ton, but I am so ready for more. In part 1, we were talking about spaced repetition, context clues, and the magic of word families. So what other secrets does our source material have for us?
Well, we've only just scratched the surface when it comes to word families.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a lot more we can explore. Remember how we were talking about roots?
Yes.
Okay, so let's add prefixes and suffixes to that mix. Those little pieces of words can completely transform a word's meaning.
Okay, so how does that actually work? Can you give me an example?
Sure. So let's think about the prefix un.
Okay.
Means not, or the opposite of.
Right.
So you can add it to happy, and you get unhappy.
Yeah.
Do the same thing with like certain, able, or even fair, and suddenly you've got uncertain, unable, and unfair.
That's so cool.
Right? You're totally flipping their meanings.
So prefixes are like these secret codes that help you unlock a ton of new words.
I like that.
What about suffixes? Do they work the same way?
Yeah, totally. Let's take the suffix abable, for example. It means capable of being.
Okay.
If you attach that to read, you get readable, wash becomes washable, break, turns into breakable, and you can even make comfortable from comfort.
So you can just create all these new adjectives.
Exactly.
This is making me see words in a whole new way.
That's the goal. The source material really encourages us to play around with these kinds of things too.
Oh.
Like, why not just try brainstorming a bunch of different prefixes and suffixes with words that you already know?
Oh, I like that. I'm already thinking act can become action, activate, actor, acting, react, interaction.
Right. It's like a vocabulary explosion.
Yeah. Pretty powerful.
Yeah. And the coolest part is that once you start to get the hang of those prefixes and suffixes, you can apply that same knowledge to so many other words.
That's awesome. Now let's get back to those tricky idioms and phrasal verbs that we were talking about before. They seem to be everywhere. I know our source material says that they're super important if you want to sound natural and understand everyday English, but how do we actually learn them?
Well, don't worry about memorizing giant lists. Instead, remember those context clues that we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
Pay attention to how idioms and phrasal verbs are used in the real world. You know, in books, movies, songs, even just everyday conversations.
So observe them in their natural environment, like a scientist would.
Exactly.
That's cool. And the source material also mentions that repetition is key.
It is, yeah. Just like with anything new, the more you practice, the easier it becomes.
So the more I encounter those expressions and try to use them, the more natural they'll start to sound.
Absolutely.
Our source also suggested grouping these expressions by theme, which I actually find really helpful. Like, I might make a list of all the weather-related idioms, like, it's raining cats and dogs, or face like thunder. Or I could create a set of work-related phrasal verbs, like, call off a meeting, or get ahead in your career.
That's a great idea.
I like that strategy. So let's revisit reading for a sec. Our source material says it's the ultimate way to boost your vocabulary. And they have a bunch of practical tips for getting the most out of our reading time. What were some of the things that stood out to you?
I really liked the suggestion to try guessing the meaning of a word before actually looking it up. You know, like before you even grab a dictionary.
Oh, so you make your brain work for it.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
Even if I don't guess the exact right meaning, it'll probably help me remember the word better in the long run.
Exactly. And if you do need to look it up, don't just glance at the definition. Write it down maybe in a vocabulary journal or something.
Oh, so create like my own personal dictionary.
Exactly. You could even write down like an example sentence.
I like that. The source material also suggests rereading the same thing after a couple of days.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing how much more I pick up on the second time around.
It really reinforces the learning. You know,
Wow.
moves those new words into your long-term memory.
That makes sense. They also say not to limit yourself to just one type of material.
Oh,
Like, the more diverse your reading is, the better.
the richer your vocabulary will become.
Exactly.
Read novels, magazines, blogs, even like technical manuals if you're feeling adventurous.
Don't forget audiobooks, too.
Yes, audiobooks are great.
Those are awesome for improving your listening comprehension, and they expose you to a ton of new vocabulary.
And our source even recommended reading aloud,
Oh, yeah.
which can help with your pronunciation and connect the words you're reading to actually speaking them.
It's like giving your mouth a workout.
Exactly.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I wanted to ask about something that the source material briefly mentions: graded readers. What are those, and how can they help someone build their vocabulary?
Graded readers are books that are specially written for language learners
Oh,
at different levels.
okay.
So they use simplified language and vocabulary to make reading easier and more enjoyable for people who are still learning.
So they're like training wheels for reading. I
Exactly.
like that.
They give you the supportive environment to practice your reading and build up your vocabulary without making you feel overwhelmed.
That's a great tip. It actually brings up another really important point that the source material makes. Choose materials that are at the right level for you.
Yes, find that sweet spot,
Yeah.
where you're challenged but not totally frustrated.
Right. Because if I'm struggling to understand every other word, it's not going to be very fun.
No, it'll
Mm.
feel like a chore. Try to aim for texts where you can understand maybe like 70 to 80% of what you're reading without a dictionary.
Okay, so it's all about finding that Goldilocks zone.
Exactly.
Not too hard, not too easy, but just right.
Just right.
Perfect. Well, this has been such an insightful conversation, but unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Oh,
But don't worry, there's one more fascinating aspect of vocabulary building that we're going to explore in part 3 of our deep dive.
oh yeah.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
And we are back for the final part of our vocabulary building extravaganza. I can't believe we're already here.
I know, right? Time flies. It really does. We've covered so much good stuff already. Spaced repetition, context clues, word families, even those tricky idioms and phrasal verbs. But our source material had one more thing up its sleeve. And it's something I've never really thought about before. Etymology. Have you ever heard of this?
Oh yeah, etymology is super cool. It's basically the history of words.
Mhm.
Where they come from, how they've changed over time.
So it's kind of like tracing a word back to its roots.
Exactly. It's like creating a family tree, but for words.
So instead of being a word detective, like we talked about with context clues, we're being word historians.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Let's say I come across the word telephone. If I dig into its etymology, what would I find?
Well, you discover that it's actually made up of two Greek words, tele, which means far, and phone, which means sound.
So it literally means far sound.
Exactly.
That's amazing. It perfectly captures what a telephone does.
Yep.
Knowing that makes the word so much more interesting and memorable.
It does.
Hmm.
And sometimes when you look at the etymology of words, you discover these surprising connections between words that seem totally different.
Oh, really? Like what?
Okay, think about the words manual and manufacture. At first glance, these seem pretty different.
Yes.
Right. But they actually both come from the Latin word manus, which means hand.
Ah.
So manual refers to something you do by hand. And manufacture literally means to make by hand.
Wow. I never would have guessed they were related. That's so cool. So how can I actually use etymology to help me learn new words?
A lot of online dictionaries will give you information about the history of words. So when you come across a new word, just take a minute to look it up. You might be surprised by what you find.
I bet I will. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways that you want our listeners to remember about building a powerful vocabulary?
The most important thing is to remember that it's a journey, not a race.
Right.
Don't beat yourself up if you forget words or if you feel overwhelmed. Just keep practicing and exploring the language.
And don't forget those awesome techniques that we talked about.
Yeah, spaced repetition, context clues, word families, read, read, read. And yes, even explore etymology.
You can make learning so much more fun.
Exactly.
Any last words of wisdom before we sign off?
Just remember that language learning should be enjoyable. So embrace the challenge.
Yeah.
Celebrate every victory, no matter how small, and never lose that curiosity about words.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining me on this vocabulary building adventure. It's been a blast.
It has.
And we hope you're feeling inspired to go out there and supercharge your English vocabulary. Until next time, happy word hunting, everyone.